Hi everyone, and welcome back to our study on the practice of the me. We continue our discussion on section 14, which, as you remember, was a conversation between Duke Ai in the State of Law and Confucius. So the Duke begins by asking about government, and Confucius replies by honing in on the importance of leaders. Leaders are important. They have power, privilege, and really that enables them to make a positive difference. Now, leaders are the people who create the culture of an organization, and as a government leader, they actually can create order or disorder in society. But Confucius doesn't stop there. Being the exemplary teacher, he goes on to tell us how to achieve good leadership. So he tells us that it's not through PR, it's not through marketing or rhetoric. We have to be a good leader by cultivating our character. And this character is not something that is based on our own thoughts or the latest bestseller, but has a normative standard. It's called the way. And this is found in the Confucian texts. But when we read the Confucian texts like the Analects, you'll see that Confucius actually doesn't elaborate too much on the way. It's actually quite abstract. In fact, he talks more about humanity. And here it tells us that cultivating the way is through humanity. That's the starting point. As we can see from both the English word and the Chinese, humanity is really the essential part of being a human. So in English, human, humanity. In Chinese, 人者,人也. So whoever created these words obviously had a very special message for us. And the more you think about it, the more insightful it becomes that this really is the central part of being a human, this sensitivity to others. Now, in this particular line, humanity means to be human, and the key is devotion to parents. It doesn't really provide us with a very clear definition of humanity. The 19th century Confucian scholar, Liu Baonan, who actually compiled one of the most comprehensive commentaries on the Analects in late imperial China, he actually points out that in the Analects, Confucius provides a very succinct definition of humanity. And this is when he's talking to one of his students. So one time, Fan Shi, the student, asks Confucius about humanity. And this time, Confucius replies with two words: love others. In Chinese, 爱人. So according to Liu Baonan, he believes that that is actually the most simplest and easiest to understand definition of humanity. It's simply love. And this love is a true love. It's a universal and unconditional love for all people and all things. And really, this is the kind of love and care for others that sustains us in everything that we do. So whether it's our work, whether it's our home life. And here Confucius says that this is actually the defining feature of being a leader. Because as a leader, we are in charge of people within our organization, our staff. We have to care for them. But more importantly, the goods, the services that our organization provides to the community means that we just have to be just as accountable to the members of the community. So it's very interesting that Confucius points to this idea of humanity, because it's not only relevant to ancient times, it's actually relevant even to today. When we look at the mission statements and values of many organizations and companies, you can see that one of the defining features is humanity, although obviously different words can be used. But it's this idea of care and benefiting others in the community. So, it's quite obvious when we look at the mission statements of charitable organizations. Obviously, they're established to improve the lives of the vulnerable in the community. But even when you look at the values of big businesses, even banks, actually in their purpose, in their mission, it's also about humanity. One of the top banks in the UK, called Barclays Bank, if you actually look up their purpose, it's actually very interesting. So I'd like to read it out to you. And you can see if you can identify these ideas of humanity and benefiting others. So this is what they say. This is their purpose. Say, we deploy finance responsibly to support people and businesses, acting with empathy and integrity, championing innovation and sustainability for the common good and the long term. And this is a bank. You can identify certain words in there. They don't use humanity, but when they talk about the importance that they value the people, they act with empathy, they act for the common good and for the long term. All of these ideas relate to the idea of humanity. So it's quite surprising that really at the, let's say the bottom line, so to speak, is this idea of helping others, loving others, regardless of what organization you run. Confucius tells us that this humanity begins with our devotion to parents, and that it's through our care, our closeness with parents, that we start developing an understanding of others. Like what we saw with King Wen last week, his story, how his attention to detail, his consistency and frequency in relation to care for his father was then translated to care for the people, in being able to think about all the different ways that he could improve their quality of life. Because when we're mindful of the sacrifices of our parents, at least in the first 3 years of our life, before we could walk or talk, or before we were toilet trained, we were largely dependent on the care of our parents. And if we can remember that, if we're mindful of that, then we can understand the need to reciprocate, to repay that kindness. And that's what family reverence is about, this devotion to parents. Now, when we can sort of bring that to mind, this family reverence, then we start to understand the needs of our parents and the thoughts and feelings of our parents. And that's really the first step to developing an overall sensitivity and empathy of all other people. Because, if you're running a business, if you're running an organization, there's a lot of people that you need to understand, your staff members. What is it that you can offer them so that they can really find their work meaningful and enjoyable and rewarding, so that they don't, change jobs? What is it that you can offer? And how is it that you can understand their concerns? And this begins with understanding the concerns of members of our own family. Now, humanity, of course, is not just loving our family and our parents only. You can see that it's more than that. You start by developing these emotional and moral skills in the comfort of one's home, through people that we are closest to, who love us and are our loved ones. But it must extend beyond the family, and even beyond the human race, to other living creatures, and ultimately the environment. So that's why when we think about many organizations today, it's not just talking about how they need to be transparent and help the community, really provide quality service for the community. They actually talk also about sustainability and the importance of being accountable to the environment, to other living creatures, and the world around us. So that's actually humanity, that it extends to all forms of life on this earth that we have to be accountable towards. So this is humanity. And Confucius talked about this in relation to leadership over 2,000 years ago. Now that's where we left off last week. Next, Confucius introduces another virtue called rightness. So he says, rightness is to be appropriate, and the key is honoring the worthy. So this, again, the structure of the sentence is such that it begins with a short definition and then how we can achieve it. So what's the first step? Is to honor the worthy. But I sort of want to really think about rightness first, because it seems to come out of the blue, doesn't it? Early in the passage, we hear that to cultivate the way, we do so through humanity. It doesn't say to cultivate the way through humanity and rightness. Right? It just talks about humanity. So how does this rightness relate to humanity? How does it fit into the picture? Well, Mencius, who was really one of the first Chinese thinkers to talk about humanity and rightness in the same breath, talk about them together as virtues that we should all cultivate. This is what he says. So he says, humanity is the human mind. It's kind of attitude and the thoughts that we bring towards everything and in all our interactions with others. It's our attitude and manner. But rightness is the human path. It's what we need to do to be able to achieve humanity, to realize humanity in specific situations. And then he warns us. He says, to quit the path and not follow it, to abandon this mind and not know enough to seek it, is indeed lamentable. So, according to Mencius, humanity and rightness are both innate moral qualities. So we all have the potential to love others and do so appropriately. However, we need to cultivate it. Otherwise, it sort of remains only as a potential that's unfulfilled, really. So he tells us that we have to walk this path. We have to seek this mind. Now, if we think back to the relationship between parent and child that we talked about before, we said that the characteristic element was this unconditional love, the purest form of love. Now, how does rightness fit into that particular relationship? And if we can understand that, then it gives us a sort of firmer idea of what rightness as a virtue really means. Now, to talk about that from the parent's perspective, there's a very famous story in the Zuo tradition to the Spring and Autumn Annals. And it's a story that's based in the state of Wei. So it's about the state leader. His name's Duke Wu. And it's found that he's favoring one of the sons, okay, one of his sons. But this son is not going to be his successor. He's one of the younger sons. Because he favors this particular son, it actually starts to affect the development of the child. The son becomes more arrogant, and on top of that, he also has violent tendencies. But because this Duke is spoiling this particular son, no one really steps in to sort of discipline the child. And there's a particular minister, Shi Que, who sees this and can sort of foretell that this is not going to be very helpful to succession. And so he remonstrates and advises the Duke, and there's this particular line in his advice. He says, one loves their child by teaching them in the right way. And, obviously not by spoiling them. However, the Duke doesn't listen to Shi Que. And when he passes away, what happens is that the eldest son, of course, succeeds him. But after a few months, Zhou Xu, the sports son, assassinates his brother and tries to take over. A few months later, of course, he is then executed himself for the crime. So you can see, of course, that this love that the Duke had for his son, in an inappropriate way, just simply by spoiling him, favouring him, actually did no favours for him, nor for the family. And because this family was the ruling house, ultimately led to disorder in the state. And you can see, of course, that it wasn't just something between parent and child, this love. What happens, of course, is when the child grows up, their habits then affect the rest of the community. So when we come back to this particular line, the right way, this rightness is the same word that's used in the virtue that we were talking about. So what it means then, of course, is that, as a parent, yes, you love your child, but you can't give them everything that they want. And sometimes you have to tell them things that they don't want to hear. So it's not about constantly pleasing your child. It's thinking about their long-term future and how to benefit them in the right way, and what's best for them. So this is the so-called rightness or appropriate ways of parenting. Now, from the perspective of the child, yes, it's about family reverence, but there's also a need for rightness as well. In the classic of family reverence, Confucius actually there's a whole chapter on remonstrance. And that's because it's important that the child, when they observe that their parents is engaging in inappropriate conduct, so inappropriate conduct being defined by, doing something illegal, doing something against ritual propriety, something that's harmful towards them or the family or the community, then this would be considered inappropriate conduct, and the child should step in. The child should step in by trying to gently advise the parent that, maybe there's a different course of action, thinking about the consequences and also giving them other options, perhaps. So Confucius tells us that simply obeying your parents' every instruction is not considered family reverence, but rather it's important to exercise our judgment, to know the difference between right and wrong, and step in where necessary. So this is this idea of remonstrance. And the highlighted word, inappropriate, in Chinese is literally this idea of rightness. So if we were to translate it literally, it would be conduct that is unright, and therefore it's translated as inappropriate conduct. So you can see that rightness is so important, even in this parent-child relationship that's characterized by an unconditional love. Now, from the perspective of the leader, so going back to leadership in government, we can think about rightness from the perspective of the leader. Yes, the leader wants to ensure that all people are cared for. In modern day terms, it'd be ensuring that everyone has a sort of minimum standard of living. So, for example, many governments will have sort of welfare benefits for their citizens. But in order to ensure that these welfare payments are fairly distributed, there's a need to set restrictions. So it's not just government handouts. There are certain rules and limits to how much you can attain. So much so that, you even need to be checked whether you're eligible. So this is this idea of rightness, that yes, the government wants to care for the people, but has to do so in an appropriate way. But going back to the text, we can sort of start to understand this idea of rightness. It's a virtue that we need to develop. But how do we do that? Confucius says the first step is honoring the worthy, in the same way that we said the first step for humanity is devotion to parents, understanding this love. So honoring the worthy. Who are the worthy? That's a key term here. Well, in the Confucian framework, the highest level of attainment is that of the sage. we have spoken about sages before, people like King Wen, Confucius, King Shun, for example. Now, the sage is someone who is thought to have realized their innate nature, who has realized this ultimate reality. So in terms of the highest learning, this person has manifested their enlightened virtue, love the people and rest in utmost goodness. So that's this idea of the sage. It's the highest level. Now, one level down is that of the worthy. So this is someone who's quite cultivated, highly cultivated, in fact, but just not yet fully cultivated. So not yet at the level of the sage. And then one level down from that is that of the exemplary person, who we've talked about a lot in terms of how they try to maintain the practice of the mean, they try to maintain cautiousness when alone, etc. So this is someone who's sort of starting out on their journey, they're cultivating, they're on the path, but not at the level of the worthy or the sage. So you start to get a feel for the fact that there are different levels of attainment, and it's all sort of on a continuum. So here, honouring the worthy means honouring someone who has noble character. We honour the worthy, not only is that the right thing to do, this idea of rightness, but because these people are experts in rightness. Through their words and actions, they teach us what rightness really means so that we can recognize it within ourselves and develop it. Now, honoring them, respecting them, means that we're able to learn from them more. This learning from them is not necessarily through, sit-down lessons, talks, lectures, etc. It's actually sometimes just by being with them, observing them, and seeing, how they deal with people. Why did they say this to this person and not to that person? Why did they do this here now when they didn't do this yesterday in the same time and place? So you start to observe and see, well, actually, there are specific situations and how they deal with certain people is different. And that's rightness. They exercise this humanity and love for others in specific ways for certain people, sort of tailored. So by being with them, by being close to them, honouring them, then you learn from them. And that's why you begin by honouring the worthy. Now, how did King Wen do this? So last week we read the story about how he developed his humanity, and this week we'll have a look at how he develops this rightness, how he was able to honour the worthy. In Chinese history, of course, King Wen is revered as the sage ruler, but equally important is his partner and teacher, really, the Taigong, Jiang Taigong, who he meets, and this meeting is quite legendary. It's recorded in a number of texts. And what I'm going to do is take an extract from one of the texts called the Six Quivers or the Liu Tao, and sort of try to delve into how it is that King Wen displays this quality of honouring the worthy. So let's take a look at that now. So King Wen is on a hunting expedition, and during this time he happens to encounter a fisherman by the riverbank. Okay? And so he asks the fisherman, "Do you enjoy fishing?" Taigong, the fisherman, replies, "Well, the exemplary person enjoys achieving their aspirations. The common person enjoys succeeding in their everyday affairs. Now, my fishing is like this." Oh, it's not a yes-no answer. It seems very cryptic, doesn't it? And naturally, King Wen asks for more details. What do you mean? Taigong replies, "Well, in fishing, there are three forms of authority. Salary, death, and offences, and fishing is the means to obtain what you seek. Its nature is deep, and from it much greater principles can be discerned." So even more cryptic, but you can start to see that, it's not just about fishing anymore. He's probably talking about, something else, politics. So King Wen continues. He's intrigued now and wants to hear more. So this very short extract, obviously the whole conversation is much longer, but what I want to draw your attention to here is how King Wen interacts with this complete stranger, this fisherman on the riverbank, a person with no title, no rank, they've never met before, and yet King Wen is able to still provide him with this respect, be open-minded to what he has to say, and be humble enough to ask him questions and really sort of be willing to hear him out. We remember how King Shun was someone who loved asking questions. And you can see here, again, this is a key quality of the sages, that, you know, someone like King Wen, the sage himself, also asks questions. As you can see, he doesn't do much else. And through the conversation, he realizes that this is no ordinary person, that Tai Gong, in fact, is quite astute in terms of political strategy, advice, and understanding about the situation at that time in the Shang dynasty, the later years of the Shang dynasty, in which the ruler was actually quite despotic. And he had various good ideas. So by the end of the conversation, what happens is that King Wen back to the royal court and actually appoints him as his teacher and a senior minister. So this is what honouring the worthy is. It's not about just simply praising this person or giving them gifts. It's actually ensuring that they have the right position, the right title and rank, so that they have a voice in the government, that they have authority in a senior role. And that's important because obviously this person is a person of character and competence, and what they say can make a positive difference to others, not just the government, but even the community. So it's important to recognize them, give them that recognition. Now, as the leader, if the leader gives this worthy person recognition, then it means that the rest of the government are also willing to learn from them, will also emulate them. More importantly, it means that the leader sets an example that everyone with character and competence should be taken seriously, that we should hear out people who have good ideas and try to use them in our policies, try to give these people a voice and authority. So by doing this, King Wen sets an example for his government that, you know, if you come into encounter someone who is virtuous, who has these ideas, then bring them in and let's hear them out. So everyone learns to respect the worthy. Now, by doing so, by learning from these great people, you're able to then cultivate your own rightness. Now, I guess a question that is often asked is, you know, wasn't King Wen already a sage? We heard how, you know, from a very young age, he had this great humanity, this devotion to his parents, and also as a leader, he was known for this humanity and benevolence. So why does he need a teacher? Well, that's just the difference between humanity and rightness, isn't it? So humanity is his aspiration and wanting to care for all the people, you know, seeing them as wounded, so that, you know, he's always thinking about what else he can do to improve their quality of life. So that's this humanity, as Mencius said, the human mind, his state of mind. But he needs to know how to go about doing and helping them in the right way. So now he doesn't necessarily have all the expertise and know-how, and that's where he needs to learn from and be supported by worthies. He needs to check his ideas with other experts to know, am I doing it right? Is there something that's better? So what's really interesting that we can learn from King Wen is that he doesn't just think that, I have these ideas and this is the best way forward, but actually he employs and appoints other ministers who he's willing to learn from and ask questions of so that he's on the right track. Most people who are in positions of power unfortunately tend to maybe just talk to their second in charge and really don't give others the time of day, particularly junior staff. They don't really listen to them. Whereas you can see here, King Wen was able to be really receptive and open to even a stranger, and more importantly, recognized him and acknowledged him within the government, giving him a position, etc. So that's what we learn from King Wen, and how it is that he develops and cultivates this idea of rightness, really cultivates and brings it out, fully realizes this innate potential, this innate quality. So if we can honor the worthy, that's really the first step to understanding the right way of achieving our humanity. That's humanity and rightness. And Confucius then introduces us to another virtue, ritual propriety. So all of these are so important in leadership. He says, in devotion to family members, there is a hierarchy. In honoring worthiness, there are grades, and these are what give rise to ritual propriety. So when we start to put into action humanity and rightness, sort of run into challenges, because you'll realize that not everyone is the same. We want to care for people, but how? This person might be a complete stranger compared to our family member. So we have to know how to do it in the right way. And the ritual propriety gives us the specifics of this. So here it gives us two sort of examples, particularly important in Imperial China. The first was the idea of how we go about loving and caring for our extended family. So in sort of Imperial China, these extended families would live together as a community. And so you would have contact with people outside your nuclear family. And it talks about how, from a Confucian perspective, there's a certain hierarchy. Now, this hierarchy is not so much a sort of rigid hierarchy, but more the sense of treating people in a different way based on their proximity to you within the family. So you're going to be treating your parents different from maybe a cousin, a third removed cousin. So first of all, they're younger than your parents, but at the same time, they're more distant in terms of the family relationship. So that's why there's this idea that, yes, we want to care for everyone in our family and including our extended family, but there's going to be differences in that care and attention. Then there's this idea of honoring worthiness that we mentioned before. But even within the different people of character and competence that we employ, there's going to be distinctions. So the people that we have under our service, yes, they might be all of great character, but they're going to have different skills and competencies and know-how. So, not everyone can be Prime Minister. Some people might be better suited as the head of a ministry because they have that particular skill and understanding in that kind of a department. So therefore, it talks about how there are grades, different titles and ranks. And particularly in Imperial China, your title and rank would obviously determine your remuneration, but also the clothes that you wore, your uniform, and also even the carriage that you would ride to work every day. So all of these show out the fact that there are different levels of and different positions in government. And so you can honor the worthy in the right way through these respective grades. And this is this idea of ritual propriety, providing specifics to our expression of humanity and rightness. Now, if we go back to the parent and child relationship, which is a bit more closer to home, you'll notice that, before we said, yes, the child has to love their parents through this idea of family reverence, and that includes rightness, making, the right decisions and judgment when you see your parents engage in inappropriate conduct. But then how do you remonstrate? This is where ritual propriety comes in. So in the Records of Ritual, one of the key texts of the ritual canon, it tells us that in the service of parents by a child, if you've remonstrated 3 times, try to tell your parents 3 times that what they're doing is not the best course of action, but they still don't heed your advice, then you should follow with more emotional pleas, so that they can understand that you're actually thinking about you're thinking about what's best for them. And it's actually quite serious, so much so that it brings you to tears. And therefore, you don't give up on them, right? So it says that even after 3 times, you shouldn't give up. And similarly, in the Deeds of Wei, which we're more familiar with, it tells us that, when we do remonstrate, according to ritual propriety, we don't shout at them. We don't sort of criticize them in front of all their friends. We try to be discreet about it. We urge them to change, but we do so even with a kind expression and a caring voice. And here it says, even if they don't accept our advice, try again. Find a better time. Judge the situation. If they don't listen, show how deeply we care. And even if they get angry with us, don't hold any grudges against them. So you can see how before we were talking about rightness, it was just this idea of making that judgment call. And here, when we're talking about ritual propriety, it tells you how, the actual particulars of, how to remonstrate with your parents. And, if we think about it on a broader level, how do we actually love our parents? We say that we love our parents, but how do we do it? And that's when we need to use ritual propriety, the guidelines in the Deeds of Wei, that tell us very clearly this sort of objective standard of whether we're doing enough, whether we are doing it in the right way, this love for our parents, including sort of not giving them everything they want, but making sure that it's appropriate. Similarly, parents loving their children also have to accord with the guidelines, in the sense that they also have to know how to exhibit the right behaviours and be the example so that their children can follow that. And that, again, accords with the standard. So humanity, rightness, is actualised through ritual propriety, this so-called etiquette, you could say. For the leader, we talked about the idea of the leader loving others, giving out welfare benefits, but they have different eligibility criteria. Well, in terms of ritual propriety, this would be sort of saying that these welfare benefits, they have regulations and laws surrounding them so that they can't be sort of exploited. And ritual propriety is then to accord with the certain laws that are in place. But of course, ritual propriety is much more than simply laws from the perspective of a leader. It's in their every action and in their every thought that they take. Because at the end of the day, where does ritual propriety come from? How does it arise? Most of us think that these so-called rules are sort of externally imposed. When we're young, our teachers tell us you have to do X, Y, Z at school. Our parents tell us you have to do X, Y, Z at home. And then when we're older, we read these texts, the classics, where, we are provided with guidelines. And it seems like it's in the book, you have to follow the book. But actually, all of this, all of these innate qualities are part of our own nature. So here in the Records of Ritual, again, it tells us that ritual propriety has its origins in heaven and is distributed through the earth. This idea of ritual propriety being the part of the ultimate reality, a manifestation of our innate nature. And it's part of our every part of our life, from how we eat, walk, talk, and not simply in our interactions with others. And this idea of politeness. It's actually how we grow and develop such that we can live flourishing lives, that we can grow and develop our humanity and rightness. So ritual propriety is not something that's external. It's only external because we're just not used to it yet. It feels unnatural. We have to sort of always accord with the book and these rules or guidelines. But actually, when we are familiar with them, it becomes second nature. Just like, washing your hands after going to the bathroom. Second nature now. We don't have to think about it. But that in itself is ritual propriety. So ritual propriety is what we would do, how we would act, what we would say if we realized our innate potential. It's very interesting when we read the Analects. There's a particular chapter 10, that pretty much is all about Confucius and how he conducts himself, rather than quotes and sayings. But actually, these observations are recorded throughout the text of the Analects and, of course, other texts like the Records of Ritual. In these observations of Confucius's conduct, doesn't say that he abides by a certain book or is according with some sort of rule. It's just the way he lives his life, the way he goes about things and how he interacts with people. And there's a particular observation about him, which is that when he's sitting next to someone who's in mourning, this person, their loved ones have passed away, then he doesn't eat to the point of being full. So this is quite interesting. This is actually now one of the rules of ritual propriety, which is the idea of etiquette, that we sympathize with someone who's in mourning. But Confucius did this not because he was necessarily, abiding by some sort of book, but actually because sitting next to this person who was mourning, he sympathized with them. He empathized with their lack of appetite. When you're mourning for someone, you just don't have any appetite. And so sitting next to this person, you wouldn't stuff your face and eat to your heart's content. You'd be sensitive to their feelings, and in a way that you take on their feelings, and you don't, in their presence, you don't eat to satiety. So Confucius did that because he was sensitive to the feelings of others. And this sensitivity, this humanity, is really the underlying aspect of ritual propriety. The classical family reverence tells us that the essence of ritual propriety is none other than respect for others, and this understanding of their needs, respecting their needs, their thoughts and feelings. So ritual propriety comes about when we have that sincerity of mind. Don't know if you've ever had this experience before, but you could travel to another country, have no idea in terms of their culture or even their language. But when you run into people on the street and you want to say thank you or you want to say sorry, there are certain gestures, manners, expressions, or the tone of your voice that you might use to convey that, even though you have no idea what their customs are or what their etiquette is. And just by doing that through your own sincerity, the other person will perfectly understand what you're trying to say, that you're trying to say thank you or you're trying to say sorry. And that's because you're doing it with sincerity, with this humanity and sensitivity to their feelings. You want to convey that thought to them in respect of them. So ritual propriety is, yes, it's in these, we develop it through our abiding by certain guidelines in the Confucian texts, etc. But we have to understand that these guidelines are really just reminding us of how we would act if we achieved and realized our innate nature. So if we had achieved our innate nature, we'd act the same as Confucius. We might even say the same things, but using today's modern language, of course, but have the same ideas in terms of how to treat people with this love and humanity. So really, when we read these texts, it's reminding us of what this latent potential that we need to uncover. And it's not something that's external. So that's this idea of ritual propriety. And so, as it states here, ritual propriety is so important. These are specifics of how we actually realize the proper way or virtue, humanity, and rightness. So sort of how we go about doing it so that we achieve these different virtues. So in this particular passage, Confucius has told us 3 key virtues, humanity, rightness, and ritual propriety, that are important in leadership. Next, he provides us with a bit of a summary. The sentence in brackets is, according to the commentaries, it's a transcription error. The sentence actually occurs later down the track, in the latter part of the text, and so I won't be explaining that sentence here. But for the purposes of textual understanding, it's important to know that even though it's considered a transcription error, we don't simply delete it. We still have to sort of understand where it comes from. Okay, so the next bit is really Confucius providing us with a summary. He says, therefore, the ruler must not fail to cultivate their character. Wishing to cultivate their character, they must not fail to serve parents. Wishing to serve parents, they must not fail to know the virtuous. And wishing to know the virtuous, they must not fail to know heaven. Now, even though the terms here are different, we can sort of correlate that with what we mentioned earlier. If we put it in a diagram, the leader who wants to attain good government and the best talent has to cultivate themselves. They do so by cultivating the way, and the first sort of step is this service to parents, this devotion to parents, as we heard about earlier. And that helps us develop our humanity. But if we want to serve parents in the right way, to learn about rightness, we have to be close to the virtuous. This idea of the virtuous is the same as the worthy from the sentences before. And ultimately, what's interesting about this passage is it doesn't end there. The main theme of the practice of the mean that you might have already picked up on is that whatever we do, whether it's in government or our own sort of self-cultivation, always leads us back to the ultimate reality. So this is the idea of heaven, always leads us back to recovering our innate nature, the enlightened virtue. So that's why it says here that, cultivating the self, serving parents, knowing the virtuous, it's not for simply profit or creating a good name for yourself, name or fame. That's actually for only one goal, and that is to know heaven. That is to recover our innate nature. So we shouldn't lose sight of that goal. And wherever we read in the practice of the mean, it always sort of takes us back to this starting point, this origin, but also our destination. So that's one of the key characteristics of the practice of the mean and why it's been called quite metaphysical and philosophical. But when you understand this principle, it's actually not that difficult. So we continue in the next passage. Confucius then says, well, It's not just about, the parent-child relationship or the, leader-team member relationship. It's about all aspects of our humanity, all our interactions. So he says that there are 5 components to the world's constantly practiced way, how we achieve this way, and 3 components to putting it into practice. The 5 relate to the 5 fundamental relationships that we've talked about before: sovereign and subject, parent and child, between spouses, siblings, and friends. And these 5 relationships are the world's constantly practiced way. Why? Because regardless of where we're born or who we are, whether this is the time of Confucius or today, all our different interactions in life can be boiled down to these fundamental ones. And most of us will have at least one. So at least the parent and child relationship. But even if, we have other friends, uncles, etc., they all sort of fit into one of these categories. And then it says that wisdom, humanity, and courage are the world's constantly practiced virtues. And the way by which they are practiced is one. So it doesn't just talk about, the different interactions we have, but how we go about ensuring fulfilling relationships. Put it together in a diagram so it's much more easier to understand. There's the 5 components, the 5 relationships on the right-hand side, and we imbue these relationships. We come to these relationships with 3 virtues: wisdom, humanity, and courage. We need to use all of these in all of the relationships that we have in our lives. But these relationships themselves are powered by one main virtue, which is that of sincerity, which is really something that makes up a very big part of the latter half of the practice of the me. And I put the Chinese there because there's some debate about, how to translate this term. In some ways, it can be said that it's another way of talking about the innate nature, manifestation of the innate nature through our words and actions. So some people have called it creativity. Roger Ames, they've termed it creativity. Some people have called it truth. So there are different ways of translating it, but I guess however you translate it, it does need further explanation. Now, this diagram, although it's much more easier to understand, can be thought of in a very fun analogy. The late Confucian scholar Xu Xingming talks about how the 5 components, this constantly practiced way, is like a path or a road that everyone has to take in their lives. We all have to deal with parents, friends, etc., and we have to know how to deal with them. And so to travel efficiently on this path and quickly through, not so much quickly, but I guess the word here is efficiently, and we don't go through these blocks, etc. We use virtues, and that's like the car that we drive. So wisdom, humanity, and courage, the car, and sincerity is the fuel that powers the car, so that we can keep it up, keep the car going. And in that way, we can think about all of these different parts of the passage and the diagram in a much more effective way. Now, I want to also spend some time talking about the 3 virtues, because we just talked about 3 virtues: humanity, rightness, and ritual propriety. But here we're given another set: wisdom, humanity, and courage. How do they all relate? Well, Du Weiming, in his seminal monograph on the practice of the me, explains this very well, that yes, in many ways, we are sometimes given lists of virtues. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But actually, at the end of the day, it all comes back to humanity. That humanity is the overarching or fundamental virtue. And it's the virtue upon which all other virtues are derived. In some respects, the other virtues are really different facets or dimensions of humanity applied in different ways. So humanity is the first cardinal virtue. And then we talked before about how rightness is, you could say, gives form to that humanity. It's how we practice humanity in certain situations. So that's this idea of doing the right thing so that we can show our love in the right way. So humanity and rightness, really two sides of the same coin. And then now we're introduced to three universal virtues, but actually we did talk about this earlier in the second section of the practice of the mean, with Zilu asking about strength, the King Shun being praised for his great wisdom. So these ideas, these virtues are reiterated in the practice of the mean, but here they're particularly named. So you can see, for example, that the rightness that we talked about before can sort of in some ways be described as a kind of courage or wisdom as well, having that judgment and acting on that judgment to realize our humanity. So that's how they sort of come about. But at the same time, you can see what Du Wei Ming means when he says that they all come from humanity. If we love others, we'll sort of think of ways to help them creatively, and also be willing to make sacrifices for that. On the other hand, a person who is courageous may not necessarily be a person of humanity. So that's why these three universal virtues have to be seen together, understood together. And then you have four virtues. So last time we spoke about humanity, rightness, ritual propriety, and then on top of that, this idea of wisdom. And finally, the five constant virtues, which is the four virtues plus trustworthiness. Now, on the outset, when we're thinking about these virtues, superficially, yes, they might be different. But when you sort of dig deeper, sort of thinking about the very center of that circle, all of them sort of come together and they're correlated. And you could say they come from humanity. But even humanity is just a label for this innate nature that we have, and this idea of oneness and love for others. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusion regarding the different types of virtues that we see in the Confucian texts. Now, this particular, why I've chosen this particular extract is because when we talk about the virtues, it can be quite abstract. So let's think about the three universal virtues in terms of a specific sort of example in history. Now, this particular scenario or this particular story is about a certain scholar of the 3rd century. His name's Li Mi. And what happens is that when he was young, his parents passed away. He was effectively an orphan, but his grandmother, his single grandmother, took him in and single-handedly raised him. At the time when he was young, he constantly was ill, as it says here, but his grandmother looked after him and never left his side. He is now in his 40s, his grandmother is in her 90s, and she has a terminal illness. And so he is really her only carer. Now, because of his great character, he's been recommended for several government posts, and he's received a lot of job offers. Because he has to care for his grandmother, he sort of declined all of the job offers, except in this particular instance, he's just received an appointment from the emperor himself. At that time, Sima Yan was the emperor, and Sima Yan wants him to be the aide to the crown prince. So this is a job offer that really can't be refused. But weighing up his different options and really not wanting to leave his grandmother, he decides to decline the job offer and writes this very famous and well anthologized letter or memorial to the emperor. And I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking through this extracts from his memorial. So he says that, as we mentioned before, that his grandmother has been ill and is constantly bedridden. And what he does is really cares for her day and night. Now, he's received more promotions than he feels he deserves. He's very humble here. And he wouldn't dare to delay in the hope of receiving something better. So clearly, there have been rumors. People have said that, maybe he's holding out for a more powerful position. And so he's saying that, how would he dare do that? He says that he believes that his grandmother is in the final years of her life, and to the extent that perhaps even not knowing whether she will survive another day. So he says that without his grandmother, without me, my grandmother would not be able to live out her remaining years. But at the same time, he would not be here today if it were not for his grandmother. And so they've sort of depended on each other throughout their lives. And he can't simply leave her now just because of a lucrative job offer. Says that in weighing up his options, he realizes that his grandmother doesn't have a long time left, doesn't have very many years left on this earth, and yet he does. So he's still able to serve king and country for a much longer period, and he just needs to have these few years to really care and repay the kindness of his grandmother. And so he finally ends by saying that, really hopes that the emperor is able to take pity on him, to understand, and be able to postpone that appointment so that he can be with his grandmother for a few more years. And ultimately, this kind of language that we read in the Chinese text, your subject kneels before your majesty to dedicate this memorial with sentiments of the utmost awe, that he does so with great sincerity. So when we read this particular memorial, which of these universal virtues is he employing? Humanity, wisdom, or courage? Well, actually, it's all. First of all, he has to recognize that he has a moral conflict. This love that he has for his grandmother versus the duty that he has to his king and country. And he recognizes that he's got a moral conflict because of his humanity, the idea of wanting to repay the kindness of his grandmother. He needs to have the courage to refuse the appointment. It's not that easy in those days. There was a lot of pressure to accept, otherwise you could even be punished. So he needs to be very careful and also at the same time have the courage to make up his mind. And then he has to have the wisdom to sort of weigh up his options and the situation and explain that in the right way to the emperor himself. So really, in writing this letter, he's using all three of the virtues, humanity, wisdom, and courage. And he does so being motivated by this love for his grandmother, ultimately. So I'm aware of the time now, but I want to leave you with this one particular line from Yan Hui, who is Confucius's top student. And he sort of encourages us by saying that, well, what kind of person was King Shun, this exemplary sage ruler? And what kind of person am I? We're both human on this earth. So one who exerts effort will also be like them. We just simply need to work on ourselves, to cultivate ourselves, whether it's to become a good leader or simply to become the best person we can be and uncover our innate potential. We simply need to never give up in practicing the mean and maintaining that state of mind wherever we are and with whoever we are with. And hopefully, through these short talks on the practice of the mean, you can understand that the greater aspect of this cultivation, it's not simply about our relationships, but it's more than that. And it sort of, at the end of the day, brings us back to the ultimate reality and brings us back to our innate nature. So I'm going to conclude now this talk on the practice of the mean. next week we'll start our talks on the Mencius, Mencius being the second sage, second only to Confucius. So we have a lot to look forward to. See you next week. Thank you very much.